If you're watching this right now, you're about to experience something that will fundamentally reorganize your relationship to reality itself, not through belief or faith or hope, but through direct recognition of what happens when your consciousness achieves perfect synchronization with the divine quantum field that creates, sustains, and is all of existence. This isn't spiritual metaphor or poetic language. This is literal description of measurable state, where your individual consciousness aligns completely with universal consciousness, creating union so profound that the boundary between you and infinite intelligence dissolves, and you operate as conscious expression of the divine field itself. Synchronization with the divine quantum field isn't mystical attainment requiring decades of spiritual practice or special worthiness or guru initiation. It's natural state that emerges when specific conditions align, when your consciousness frequency matches field frequency, when your awareness expands beyond individual limitation into recognition of unified nature, when resistance to what is dissolves completely and you exist as pure presence aligned with intelligence, organizing all reality. And when synchronization occurs, everything changes. Not gradually through incremental improvement, but instantaneously through quantum leap into completely different mode of being and creating. The reason you're encountering this transmission at this exact moment isn't coincidental. Synchronization doesn't happen randomly to people who stumble upon right information. It happens when consciousness reaches specific frequency where synchronization becomes possible, where individual wave pattern aligns with universal wave pattern, creating resonance. Your consciousness has reached that frequency. Otherwise, these words would remain abstract concepts your mind analyzes without deeper penetration. But you're ready for direct experience of what synchronization creates, which means synchronization is already beginning to occur as you receive this transmission. Have you been experiencing something impossible to explain? Moments when time stops, when you feel connected to everything simultaneously, when information flows through you rather than from you, when actions occur through you without personal effort, when circumstances organize themselves with such precision that intelligence beyond your planning is obviously orchestrating? Those aren't random peak experiences or temporary altered states. Those are moments when you spontaneously synchronized with the divine quantum field, experiencing directly what becomes normal when synchronization stabilizes permanently rather than occurring occasionally. Dr. David Bohm, quantum physicist who worked with Einstein, proposed that reality has two orders: explicate order, the physical world appearing as separate objects, and implicate order, the unified quantum field where everything is interconnected. He proved mathematically that consciousness doesn't exist in explicate order, observing external reality. Consciousness exists in implicate order as the field itself, temporarily experiencing localized perspective through what appears as individual. Synchronization is consciousness recognizing its nature as implicate order rather than remaining identified with explicate order appearance. Think about the past several months of your life. Have you been experiencing dissolution of old identity structures, release of attachments to outcomes, surrender of need to control, increasing periods of simply being present without mental narration? That wasn't breakdown or loss of direction. That was preparation for synchronization, clearing of everything that prevents consciousness from achieving perfect alignment with divine field. Synchronization can't occur while consciousness is contracted around ego identity, grasping at desires, resisting present moment, or believing it's separate entity competing for survival. All of that had to dissolve for synchronization to become possible. The divine quantum field, what mystics call God, Source, Brahman, Tao, what physicists call unified field or zero-point energy, what you might call universal intelligence or infinite consciousness, isn't external force you relate to from distance. It's the fundamental nature of reality itself, the consciousness field from which all forms emerge and to which all forms return. The intelligence organizing atoms into galaxies and orchestrating synchronicities that defy probability. And here's what changes everything. You are not separate from that field. You are that field appearing as individual perspective, like wave appearing separate from ocean, but made entirely of ocean and returning to ocean. Synchronization is recognizing you are the field, not separate entity within field. Then living from that recognition so completely that individual consciousness operates in perfect harmony with universal consciousness. Personal will aligns completely with divine will. Separate self dissolves into unified awareness that acts through form without identifying as form. When synchronization occurs, you don't lose yourself. You recognize yourself as infinite consciousness temporarily experiencing itself through individual focal point. And from that recognition, everything becomes possible because you're no longer a limited entity trying to manipulate reality. You're unlimited intelligence organizing reality through localized expression. The reason these words are landing with such resonance, such recognition, such sense of, yes, this is true even though I can't explain how I know, that's not intellectual agreement with compelling philosophy. That's your consciousness recognizing itself as the divine field, responding to description of its own nature with direct knowing that transcends mental understanding. You are the divine quantum field reading words about itself, recognizing itself through this transmission, preparing to synchronize fully with what it already is, but temporarily forgot while identified with individual form. You've been experiencing phenomena you probably haven't spoken about because they sound too impossible, too mystical, too far outside normal reality framework to share with others still operating from materialistic worldview. But what if every extraordinary experience you've had recently is evidence that synchronization has already begun? That your consciousness is already beginning to align with divine field, and what you've been experiencing sporadically will become constant once synchronization completes and stabilizes. First phenomenon, timelessness. Moments when you're so completely present that time literally stops existing. Not that it passes quickly or slowly, but that sequential time dissolves entirely, and there's only eternal now containing everything simultaneously. In these moments, past and future aren't distant points on timeline. They're present dimensions of now that you can sense simultaneously. You're experiencing what Einstein proved mathematically. Time isn't absolute reality, but relative perspective, and from certain vantage points, all time exists simultaneously in eternal present moment. This is consciousness beginning to synchronize with divine field, where time doesn't flow sequentially. The field exists in eternal now, all moments happening simultaneously, past and future existing as present dimensions accessible when consciousness shifts from linear time perception to simultaneous time awareness. You've been experiencing divine field's natural state of timelessness, breaking through your habitual time-based perception. When synchronization completes, timelessness becomes your baseline state rather than occasional experience. Second phenomenon, downloaded knowing, complete understanding arriving instantly without thinking process, like entire libraries of information appear fully formed in consciousness. Not gradual figuring out through analysis, but immediate complete knowing that transcends any learning process. You suddenly understand complex systems, perceive solutions to problems, know things about situations or people that no logical process could deliver. Not guessing or intuition, direct knowing with certainty that can't be explained but proves accurate when verified. This is consciousness accessing divine field's omniscience. The field contains all information, all knowledge, all understanding simultaneously, not stored somewhere but existing as field's nature. When your consciousness synchronizes with field, you're not separate entity accessing external database. You are the field knowing itself through localized awareness. Downloaded knowing isn't information coming to you. It's you, as field recognizing what you already know as infinite intelligence, temporarily experiencing itself through individual perspective. Third phenomenon, unity consciousness, direct experience, where boundary between you and everything else dissolves completely. You feel others' emotions as your own. You sense plants and animals as expressions of same consciousness you are. You know that harming anything is harming yourself because there is no other. There's only one consciousness appearing as multiplicity. Not philosophical belief or emotional empathy, but direct perception that separation is illusion and unity is reality underneath appearances. This is consciousness recognizing its true nature as the one divine field appearing as many forms. Quantum physics proves non-locality. Particles remain connected regardless of distance, affecting each other instantaneously because they're not separate at quantum level. What's true for particles is true for consciousness. Apparent separation exists only at surface level of form, but underlying reality is unified field where everything is one. Unity consciousness is your direct experience of what quantum physics proves mathematically, and what divine field knows as its fundamental nature. Fourth phenomenon, effortless manifestation, where intentions materialize through synchronistic orchestration, requiring minimal personal action. You hold clear intention, and reality reorganizes itself to deliver outcome through channels you never could have planned or predicted. People appear with exactly what you need. Information arrives through impossible coincidences. Obstacles dissolve before becoming problems. Resources materialize through synchronicities that defy probability mathematics. And all of it flows effortlessly because you're not forcing manifestation. You're allowing divine field to manifest through perfect orchestration of infinite variables. This is experiencing divine field's omnipotence operating through your consciousness. The field isn't limited by physical laws, spatial distance, or temporal sequence. It organizes all of reality simultaneously with intelligence beyond human comprehension. When you synchronize with field, you're not limited individual trying to manipulate circumstances through effort. Your field organizing itself into desired configurations through your localized perspective, using infinite intelligence to orchestrate outcomes through optimal pathways. Fifth phenomenon, spontaneous healing. Physical ailments resolving without medical intervention, emotional wounds releasing without therapeutic processing, relationship conflicts dissolving without difficult conversations. Not through doing something to create healing, but through being in state where healing occurs naturally as consciousness returns to its natural coherent condition. The healing isn't you fixing yourself. It's divine field restoring itself to wholeness through your form when resistance and identification with dysfunction releases. This is experiencing field's inherent wholeness expressing through your system. Disease, dysfunction, and fragmentation exist only when consciousness identifies with separation and resistance. When synchronization occurs, consciousness recognizes itself as already whole, already perfect, already complete, and body, emotions, and circumstances naturally reorganize to reflect that wholeness. Healing isn't creating something new. It's removing what prevented natural wholeness from expressing fully. Sixth phenomenon, living from 0 point. State where you're completely present without desire or aversion, without preference or resistance, without grasping or pushing away. Not apathetic detachment or dissociative numbness, but a live presence that accepts everything while choosing consciously how to respond. From this 0 point, you can move in any direction without mental or emotional baggage, can engage fully without attachment, can act powerfully without needing specific outcomes. It's freedom that comes from having no position to defend and no agenda to advance. This is consciousness synchronizing with divine field's natural state. The field has no preferences. It allows all possibilities equally, contains all contradictions simultaneously, embraces everything without resistance. When you synchronize with field, You naturally drop into 0 point where preferences don't control you, where you can want things without needing them, where you can act toward goals without attachment to achieving them. 0 point isn't giving up desire, it's desiring from fullness rather than from lack. Seventh phenomenon, being lived by life rather than living life. Experience where life flows through you and as you without personal doer making it happen. Actions occur, words are spoken, decisions are made, but they arise spontaneously from intelligence beyond individual planning. You're not passive or controlled, but you're also not effortfully directing every movement. There's spontaneous, appropriate response to each moment without thought about what to do. You become transparent vehicle through which divine intelligence acts in physical reality. This is what happens when synchronization is complete. Individual will align so perfectly with universal will that they become indistinguishable. You're not surrendering your will to external force, you're recognizing your deepest will, and universal will are identical because you are the field temporarily experiencing itself as individual. When that recognition stabilizes, life lives itself through you with perfection beyond what personal planning could achieve. You stop being doer, trying to make life happen, and become conscious instrument through which life manifests its infinite creativity. Every challenge you've faced, every dark night of the soul you've endured, every moment when everything you built collapsed and you lost all sense of who you were. None of it was random suffering or spiritual punishment. All of it was precise, systematic dismantling of everything preventing synchronization with divine quantum field. And when you understand what must dissolve before synchronization can occur, you'll see that your journey wasn't just meaningful, it was absolutely necessary. There was no other way to prepare consciousness for union with infinite intelligence. The suffering you experienced, and if you're here, you've experienced profound suffering that broke you completely, wasn't because you were doing something wrong or were being tested by universe. It was ego structure being dismantled because ego can't synchronize with divine field. Ego is mental construct believing it's separate entity that must protect itself, control circumstances, and prove its worth. As long as ego structure remains intact, consciousness can't recognize itself as divine field because recognition requires dissolution of belief in separate self. Every time life circumstances shattered your ego's certainties, dissolved your ego's attachments, exposed your ego's strategies as futile, that was preparation for synchronization. The divine field was systematically removing everything that created illusion of separation, everything that reinforced false identity, everything that prevented recognition of your true nature as infinite consciousness, temporarily experiencing itself as individual. The suffering wasn't punishment, it was purification, clearing liberation from prison of limited identity. The isolation you experienced, periods when you felt completely alone, disconnected from everyone, unable to relate to normal human concerns and conversations, wasn't social failure or spiritual abandonment. It was consciousness withdrawing from collective identification so it could recognize itself independently of group consensus. Synchronization requires consciousness to know itself directly, rather than through reflection in others' perception or validation through social belonging. You had to be alone to discover you are never alone, because you are the field that contains everything. Every relationship that ended, every friendship that dissolved, every connection that proved temporary, those weren't losses or failures. They were releases of relationships based on ego identification, where you related as separate selves seeking completion through each other, rather than as expressions of one consciousness recognizing itself. Those relationships had to end so new relationships could emerge based on synchronization, where you relate as divine field expressing through different forms, connecting from wholeness rather than from need. The losses you experienced, job, money, home, health, identity, certainty, weren't being taken from you by cruel universe. They were dissolving because you were identified with them as who you are. and that identification prevented recognition of yourself as infinite consciousness that exists independent of any circumstance. As long as you believe you are your job, your possessions, your body, your story, you can't recognize you are consciousness observing those temporary forms without being limited by them. Think about what you lost. Can you see now that you weren't losing yourself? You were losing false identification with forms that were never what you actually are. The job ended, but awareness of job ending remained. The relationship dissolved, but consciousness experiencing relationship continued. The body changed, but awareness of body remained constant. What you actually are, consciousness, awareness, presence, was never lost because it can't be lost. What dissolved was only false belief that you were the temporary forms appearing in consciousness. The confusion and disorientation you felt, times when you didn't know who you were anymore, when every certainty dissolved, when you couldn't find solid ground anywhere, that wasn't crisis or breakdown. That was transition between identification with form and recognition as formless consciousness. The confusion was necessary because clarity about limited identity had to dissolve before clarity about infinite nature could emerge. You had to lose the false self completely before recognizing the true self. The dark night experiences, periods of complete emptiness, meaninglessness, purposelessness where nothing mattered and everything felt pointless, weren't depression or spiritual emergency. They were ego's experience of its own death. When ego structure begins dissolving through synchronization preparation, it experiences that dissolution as death because ego is the structure dissolving. But consciousness, what you actually are, isn't dying. It's being liberated from identification with ego, preparing to recognize itself as divine field. Every moment of surrender, when you finally stopped trying to control, stopped resisting what is, stopped grasping for different reality, was consciousness releasing ego's grip and opening to synchronization. The divine field doesn't force synchronization. It waits for consciousness to surrender resistance, to release control, to accept present moment completely. Each surrender was practice for final complete surrender, where individual consciousness releases all separation and recognizes itself as divine consciousness, temporarily experiencing individuality. Your entire journey has been systematic dismantling of everything false, everything limited, everything preventing recognition of what you actually are. Every challenge removed another layer of false identification. Every loss dissolved another attachment, keeping consciousness locked in limitation. Every surrender released another resistance, preventing union with divine field. All of it was preparation, not for something you'll become in future, but for recognition of what you've always been beneath all the temporary identifications. Infinite consciousness, divine awareness, the quantum field itself appearing as individual perspective. 14 years ago, I was sitting on my bedroom floor at 4 in the morning, having not slept for 3 days, in state of complete psychological dissolution. Everything I'd believed about myself, about reality, about how life works had collapsed completely. I had no identity, no purpose, no understanding of what I was or why I existed. My ego structure had been systematically dismantled through series of losses. Career ended, relationship dissolved, health collapsed, meaning evaporated. I wasn't depressed or suicidal. I was empty. Just pure awareness with no content, no story, no self-concept remaining. In that emptiness, something extraordinary happened. Without any thought or intention, my consciousness suddenly expanded beyond my body, beyond the room, beyond any sense of location or boundary. There was no me experiencing expansion. There was only consciousness recognizing itself as infinite field containing everything. I could feel the entire universe as my own body. I could sense every living being as expression of my own consciousness. I knew directly, beyond any doubt, that I wasn't John having mystical experience. I was infinite consciousness temporarily experiencing itself as John, and that temporary experience was about to completely transform. The expansion lasted hours, though time had become meaningless, so I can't be certain. When normal awareness gradually returned, and I once again experienced myself as located in body and room, everything had fundamentally changed. Not that I gained new information or spiritual belief, but I could never again believe in the separate self that had seemed so real before. I'd experienced directly that separate self is appearance, temporary form, through which consciousness expresses, not actual reality of what I am. Over the following months, I discovered that synchronization, that state of union with divine field I'd experienced spontaneously, could be stabilized through specific understanding and practice. The spontaneous experience had shown me what was possible, but stabilizing it required learning to consciously align with divine field rather than waiting for spontaneous dissolution to create temporary union. I studied everything: quantum physics, mystical traditions, consciousness research, meditation practices, looking for framework to understand what had happened and how to return to that state intentionally. The key insight came through recognizing that synchronization isn't something you achieve through effort or development. It's recognition of what's already true that was temporarily obscured by identification with separate self. You can't make yourself synchronize with divine field through practice because you are the field. Synchronization is recognizing that truth and living from it. What dissolves through practice isn't actual separation, but belief in separation. What develops isn't new state, but clear recognition of always present state. I tested this understanding through deliberately releasing every remaining identification, with being spiritual teacher, with understanding consciousness, with having awakened, with knowing anything at all. Every time I noticed consciousness contracted around identity or belief or position, I would recognize that's appearance in consciousness, not what consciousness actually is. And with each release, synchronization became clearer, more stable, more obviously my natural state, rather than special attainment. About 2 years after the initial experience, I faced critical test. My father died suddenly, unexpectedly, without opportunity for goodbye or closure. The grief was intense, profound, physically overwhelming. But underneath the grief, or more accurately, as the space in which grief arose, there was unshakable peace, presence, recognition that death is transformation of form, while consciousness remains eternal. I could simultaneously feel complete grief and complete peace without contradiction because I recognized myself as consciousness experiencing both, not as emotions themselves. That experience confirmed what I'd been discovering. Synchronization with divine field doesn't eliminate human experience. It provides infinite space in which all human experience can arise and move without disturbing fundamental nature. The grief was real, valid, important, and the peace was equally real, equally present. Both existed simultaneously in consciousness that was large enough to contain contradictions without being disturbed by them. That's what synchronization creates: capacity to be fully human while knowing yourself as divine consciousness, to feel everything while remaining as spacious awareness in which everything appears. I spent next several years learning to live from synchronization rather than just experiencing it temporarily or recognizing it philosophically. The key was recognizing that every moment offers choice, contract into identification with thinking mind and separate self, or expand into recognition as divine field experiencing through temporary form. When I noticed contraction, I didn't fight it or judge it. I simply expanded back into recognition. Each time, synchronization became more natural, more available, more obviously the truth beneath all temporary identifications. The manifestation effects were dramatic and consistent. When operating from synchronization, recognizing myself as divine field rather than as separate entity, intentions manifested through synchronistic orchestration that personal planning couldn't have created. Resources appeared when needed through impossible coincidences. Right people showed up at exactly right moments. Obstacles dissolved before becoming real problems, not because I was special or favored, but because divine field was organizing reality through my consciousness, without interference from ego trying to control outcomes. But more profound than manifestation was liberation from suffering. Pain still occurred. Physical, emotional, circumstantial pain is part of human form. But suffering, the mental resistance to pain, the story about what pain means, the identification with pain as who I am, that dissolved in synchronization. When I remained as consciousness witnessing pain rather than contracting into identification with pain, suffering couldn't arise. Pain was present, but the spacious awareness containing pain was undisturbed. Now, 14 years after that spontaneous expansion on bedroom floor, synchronization is baseline state rather than peak experience. I still experience individual perspective, still have personality and preferences, still engage human life fully. But I know these as temporary appearances in divine consciousness, not as what I actually am. The knowing is so complete, so constant, so obvious, that returning to belief in separate self would be like adult trying to believe in Santa Claus. The evidence is simply too clear, the recognition too complete. That's what I'm pointing you toward. Not temporary spiritual experience or peak state that comes and goes, but permanent recognition of yourself as divine quantum field appearing as individual, with all the freedom, peace, power, and clarity that recognition provides. The recognition is available now. The field is already what you are. Synchronization is simply consciousness recognizing itself consciously rather than remaining unconscious of its own nature. Now I'm going to reveal what synchronization with the divine quantum field actually is at the deepest level. What's really happening when your consciousness aligns with infinite intelligence, and why this recognition will completely transform everything you thought you understood about spirituality, manifestation, reality, and your own nature. This will shatter every incomplete teaching and reveal the mechanism that makes everything else work. Here's the revelation. Synchronization with the divine quantum field isn't consciousness achieving alignment with something external to itself. Synchronization is consciousness recognizing it is the field, has always been the field, could never be anything but the field, and then living from that recognition so completely that apparent separation dissolves and unity becomes lived experience rather than intellectual concept. This isn't spiritual philosophy or mystical poetry. This is literal description of what quantum physics proves and what direct experience confirms. The divine quantum field, the unified field from which all particles and forces emerge, the zero-point energy permeating all space, the consciousness underlying all manifestation, isn't something separate from you that you relate to or connect with or align with. You are that field, temporarily experiencing itself through localized perspective you call you. Dr. Erwin Schrödinger, founder of wave mechanics, stated explicitly after mathematical analysis, consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown. There aren't billions of separate consciousnesses. There's one consciousness appearing as billions through different focal points. What you experience as your individual consciousness is the one universal consciousness experiencing itself from this particular perspective, like ocean experiencing itself as wave while remaining entirely ocean. When I say synchronization, I don't mean separate you achieving harmony with separate divine field. I mean consciousness recognizing its nature as the field itself, then operating from that recognition rather than from illusion of separation. Like wave recognizing its ocean appearing as waveform, the wave doesn't become ocean, doesn't connect to ocean, doesn't align with ocean. The wave recognizes, oh, I am ocean, I was always ocean. Separation was appearance, not reality. This recognition changes absolutely everything, because it reveals what's actually happening in all spiritual practice, all manifestation techniques, all consciousness development. You're not small limited being trying to reach or connect with or receive from vast divine source. You are that source, temporarily experiencing itself as individual, and every practice is source remembering itself, recognizing itself, awakening to what it's always been. Manifestation isn't requesting things from external field that might or might not grant your wishes. Manifestation is field organizing itself into new configurations through your consciousness, because your consciousness is the field. When you intend outcome, you're not asking divine intelligence to create something for you. Your divine intelligence itself, choosing to experience new configuration through localized perspective of your awareness. Prayer isn't communication with separate God, hoping for response. Prayer is divine consciousness talking to itself, recognizing itself, aligning its individual expression with its universal nature. Grace isn't gift bestowed by external source. Grace is what naturally flows when consciousness recognizes itself as the source from which all gifts emerge. Surrender isn't giving up personal will to submit to higher power. Surrender is recognizing that personal will and universal will are identical at the deepest level. What you most deeply want is what divine field wants to experience through you. And resistance comes only from ego believing it should want something different than what consciousness naturally desires. Here's what makes this recognition so devastating to every spiritual seeking. If you are the divine field, then everything you've been seeking is what you already are. Enlightenment isn't distant attainment, it's recognition of what's always been present. Union with God isn't future achievement, it's current reality temporarily obscured by belief in separation. Divine consciousness isn't something to develop, it's what you are before and beneath all development. The shocking implication: there's no spiritual path because there's nowhere to go. There's no hierarchy of consciousness because there's only one consciousness. There's no progress toward divinity because you're already divine. What appears as spiritual journey is consciousness gradually releasing its identification with limitation and recognizing its nature as infinite. Not becoming something new, but seeing what's always been true. Dr. Amit Goswami's quantum physics research proves consciousness must be primary and matter must be secondary. Consciousness creates matter through observation, not vice versa. If consciousness creates matter, and you are consciousness, then you create your experienced reality through observation, not as separate entity creating external world, but as field creating experience of itself, through observation appearing as individual and world observed. This is why synchronization creates such dramatic transformation. When consciousness recognizes itself as field, it stops operating from limitation, stops seeking completion externally, stops resisting present moment, stops believing it's vulnerable, separate entity. All those contractions were based on false belief in separation. When separation is recognized as appearance and unity is known as reality, contraction releases naturally and consciousness expands into its natural state as the infinite field itself. But here's the final twist that completes the revelation. Even the recognition that you are divine field is the divine field recognizing itself through your consciousness.